Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. Today, we are picking up speed. The mic quality may be a little poor today because I've switched around some things relative to stream stations, but hopefully it will not be unbearable and you'll be able to get through regardless of that. Our main topics today are going to be about how to think about fighting games faster, particularly as Street Fighter 6 closes in. A lot of us are going to want to make our progress quickly, because if you don't, you get stuck in that tier where people keep on jumping at you forever. And it's harder to anti-air in that game, despite technically supposed to be easier, mainly because the anti-airs themselves are a little harder to go with the fact that the jumps are a little easier to counter if you're expecting them. Today, however, we're not necessarily going to have as much to say unless we get a lot of people joining in. If you are hoping to join in, go ahead and do so. But we do expect these to fill up a little quickly, as this is one of those Win 10 Battle Lounge matches weeks, and usually that means we get at least a couple extra people. That said, if we don't get additional joiners and we do have mostly just the same people as always, this applies even if it is people beyond the team but are still just regulars, I won't necessarily have as much to say because of the very nature of what we're talking about. So, there will definitely be some periods of silence, and you can usually expect them because they'll just be when you see team members already fighting. We've also talked about this matchup relatively at length. It mostly has to do with people getting into the correct position and then making sure not to lose it. These two fight from similar ranges, and generally, as we've mentioned before, Necalli's only real job here is to make a slow advance based on the fact that Lucia, especially our Lucia, will backdash out of nearly everything. Trying to land attacks against someone who is backdashing to get away from you is by nature more difficult. That's why they're backdashing. So you generally should just walk forward, take the time, and get what advantage you can by getting them close to the corner where they can no longer do that and you actually have an advantage. Lucia does have ways to close back the space quickly if you are too timid about your own approaches, but she also isn't very tricky about these. She's a little tricky, but not enough so that a character like Necalli will have a lot of problems. In fact, in general, Necalli mostly just needs to walk forward and wait. The thing that makes this matchup be balanced is mostly that Necalli's best way of getting through her fireballs involves not walking forward. But as her fireballs aren't really a concern for Necalli too much, it's usually fine. Similarly, if you've gotten yourself to the point where your opponent is trying to stay out of your range, you don't really need to play footsies at all. Footsies isn't the thing that's going to happen. In fact, as you saw there, walking forward into Lucia's moves messes with the opponent's timing enough that you might be able to hit her before she actually executes the follow-up as shown there, making it even easier to just take control of the situation by showing strength, confidence, and walking forward. The wiggle that you're seeing our Necalli do is in fact the reason he's losing, because the wiggle is the unnecessary part of this matchup. You can just walk forward. Every moment you spend in defense is a moment that you are basically giving up, and more likely to lose. So we'll see if DWuulfe can make the adaptations to be more effective based on the things we've discussed about this matchup before. There's nothing specific to tell our Lucia right now because they're just playing the base strategy at the moment, and since their opponent hasn't forced them to adapt to anything, there's no real reason to change that. It's more important to be aware of what your adaptation is if you've had to use it before, so that you can tell when your opponent is forcing you into it. Even that, I'm fairly sure that would have been a benefit to our Necalli, but he walked backwards a little bit. There isn't usually a need to dash, but you can. It doesn't do much harm, especially if you're dashing while chasing a bat dash. But Necalli, like many of DWuulfe's characters, has a really specific tendency. He either lunges to make his attacks, or maintains control by hitting buttons, and the buttons he's choosing are the thing that matter. In short, DWuulfe isn't used to walking in fighting games, because he doesn't choose characters where walking is a primary strategy. It's usually either do a long move, or do a block string that puts the opponent in a position he prefers, and then do a mix-up of long move or nothing at that point. But walking is actually kind of difficult for him because he just doesn't have practice for either doing it or understanding what exactly he's trying to get out of it. Fortunately, for this matchup, he doesn't really have to learn to walk from the perspective of trying to play footsies with it. He just has to walk forward for the sake of walking forward. Once one understands the options the opponent has available, you can just do this. And you already see the adaptation beginning. Similarly, because Lucia is the way she is, if you're walking forward, you're already in a better position to do Necalli's uppercut, as you basically don't have to do anything much. And she's relatively easy to uppercut out of stuff. So with that adaptation achieved, we're now going to have to watch if our Lucia can also make a shift.
Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! Necalli wins. It's go time. Let's do this.
Alright, let's hope that the connection between these two players is good. Our Lucia and Karin will probably need to watch this match more specifically than they usually do, as understanding how exactly to fight Gill is kind of difficult because he has so many options, but none of them are desperately like a thing you must avoid. He has all of this range of options that are all about the same strength. So you won't generally ever take too much damage. In fact, his fastest options tend to hurt you the least, presumably for balance reasons. But it seems that the player has gone for Seth instead, and that's not quite as bad. Seth definitely has more of the here is my good linear option than Gill does. So we'll switch to that instead. For Necalli, this is a relatively difficult matchup because Seth doesn't really need to be in spaces that Necalli can easily hit and can anti-air pretty easily. Dash blocking helps quite a lot here, as does the same walking to corner, but because Necalli often has to be really ready for the anti-air, he faces a similar problem to Karin, where if you think Seth is going to jump, you have to be super ready for it. But if you spend too much time in that mental space, you will get messed up anyway. It's good to make Seth players block quite a lot for both Karin and Necalli. Lucia doesn't care as much, but generally you want to make them block because it makes them slow down in a specific way. And there's the first sign of quite a lot of lag. Okay, might be back to normal, probably just a moment. So if you can't jump, because Necalli will basically get anti-aired every time simply because the space they're standing at will cause it. And when you get anti-aired, you end up exactly where Seth wants you. Your only real recourse is to force Seth to block, and when you realize I have control of neutral because you must block me, I'm slightly better than you, I have the better crush counter button, I have the better sweep. Seth can be fairly susceptible to sweeps. Once you've got all that down, the thing that Necalli most cares about is either neutral jumping or forward jumping to hit as the air-to-air. Particularly with the crouch, with the jumping medium punch, sorry. Seth does so much damage that you can't really afford to play close up in the first place. Often you have to try to backdash out of things that you probably shouldn't even survive backdashing out of. So you don't get a lot of chances for this to work out super well. For this, therefore, Seth is a character that reduces Necalli's options in the match pretty low, but if you're too used to playing very complex matchups, it may take a little while to struggle your way through what really needs to happen. If you boil it down to two things though, basically, Seth is good at jumping, but doesn't tend to hit Necalli well with combos if Necalli is advancing at the time. Unlike nearly everyone else, Necalli is free to just use advancing moves and assume that that's not going to result in death. So the stand heavy kit gets a lot of use. In fact, it's a semi-optimal scenario. As soon as you've hit it, as soon as you realize I have control here, at least a little bit of it, you should expect that the Seth player will do something to get control back, but Seth doesn't actually have instant options for that. In short, Use the stand heavy kick and the sweep to get control, and then expect the opponent to jump. That also helps. That move is quite good here. Your goal isn't really to ever open Seth up, because Seth is a character that generally punishes much harder if you mess up your stuff than if you did the correct defenses, like that. But Seth almost always has to spend quite a lot of energy to do things. So if you are trying to open Seth up, you're probably making a mistake. Compared to most characters like this, Seth has a lot more spaces in which you can slip between things like hitboxes and hurtboxes. I do, somewhat mockingly, call this character one-button Chun, but there are weaknesses such that Seth isn't just flatly the better character. Seth's weakness is generally that if you know where to aim, you will hit, whereas with Chun-Li, you can't be sure that you will actually hit her. She might do something you don't expect, or just not be there for some other reason.
Seth wins.
Unfortunately, DWuulfe is not terribly good at adapting to characters that don't need to be opened up, because this results in the same thing as mentioned before. There's a pressure to play some form of footsies, and since it by nature almost always will fail, there's nothing much you can do there. The key is to keep your control of when the opponent can jump, rather than specifically trying to be prepared for every jump they could possibly make. Force them to only jump from certain places by hitting things like the max range heavy kick, or just do disc guidance for no specific reason. Necalli's down forward heavy punch also helps somewhat after that, because again it moves Necalli forward and yet has at least a chance of beating a bunch of stuff that Seth does. This improves even more when you recognize that the crush counter it gives you on most of Seth's normals is pretty good. Not in terms of being able to get a lot of damage off it, but it restores your control so heavily that you really don't have to worry for that moment.
Round one.
Let's see what this Necalli thinks of the same. There's the heavy kick, and note, also using the heavy kick very close results in the same situation. There's the neutral jump. Yeah, they already understand this matchup. So it's going to be relatively hard from CV Frilla's side. Similarly, making the Seth player expect the heavy kick means that you get things like the dash up throw. But you should probably prove it to them a couple times first. That was probably lag. Because even when you are not sure which of those it is, you can punish all of them, so it's probably best to try. Generally, you want to keep control of Seth's movement because just look at that damage. You don't have to ask a lot of questions as to why it is. But Seth is relatively easy to control if you are paying attention to a specific aspect of it. Right here, for example, move up to the space, dash block, and they were probably planning to hit the heavy kick. There's the sweep. Risking the jump, I wouldn't, but sometimes you gotta test your opponent. The other reason you don't want to mess with this too much is exactly that. It's too hard to land some of Necalli's more crazy combos. Heavy kick. Not care about any of that. And that was unfortunate mainly because the block stun allows Seth to control the position. In fact, I'm not sure why this player chose to use that, but it does help in the matchup because the other V trigger isn't really good against Necalli much. If you're good at confirming off damage and don't expect to be caught up in defense, go for it. But if you just have to fight a default Necalli and you know how to use the orb well, you probably should, simply because it messes with Necalli's spacing enough to get you openings, even if it never does any damage. And since this matchup is definitely not very bar heavy for Seth, you're probably fine. I feel that was the right choice, to try to go for the Leaping Claw, the down forward heavy punch. But opponent was just too ready, I guess. And once again, we can't really be sure how laggy this actually is.
Seth wins.
But even with relatively bad lag, this player isn't really trying to abuse it either. We're seeing very little of the Seth just jumping and doing instant stuff because they can. They tend to jump more so at the timings where you should have been expecting them to jump at least a bit. It's probably making that defense a little bit hard, but not like overwhelming. But it definitely is at least somewhat laggy for someone, I would expect. The Seth tendency to wake up with uppercut. This happens because it's just one of your better strategies. There are many situations where being pressured is just not quite a death sentence, but it messes with the character's rhythm enough because Seth isn't terribly good at getting control back once lost. It's easier to do that off of stray hits and footsies or off getting anti-aired, but like getting knocked down properly, it's not great. The anti-air ready this time. Yep, I was expecting the heavy kick there, but I could see why reasons to not do it. There it is. And just be ready with the anti-air. I'm sure there's a higher level of this matchup, but I've never actually watched two high-level players at it long enough to be sure. Because I don't remember, I should probably go look for like matchable versus somebody to be sure they'll hit, but both of them move so much and in ways that make the other one's options not great ideas all the time. So it's probably, even if there is much higher level to this matchup, it probably doesn't look that different from this because you still have to use it. It isn't like one of those matchups where, okay, we both know what our gimmicks are, so we'll just not use any of them and play raw footsies, because neither of them is a character who's great at that. Seth has a lot of options for being confusing in footsies, but not a lot of options for like dominating in footsies. That, for example, is good, but one, doesn't hurt that much, and two, doesn't work that well on characters who could just wake up with stuff. Side switch, and once again, you should bait the uppercut on Seth like 2/3 of the time. Especially if you have one of those characters where you have good anti-pressure buttons where you could just uppercut them out of their own wake-up block string and stuff like that. It's better to just bait Seth because you'll get so much damage. And Seth's throw stuff isn't so great either. In fact, a lot of the time you can just backdash on Seth's wake-up, I think, and you will still survive, but this is not true for every character. Alright, I have no idea how good or bad this will be, but we'll see. I would expect a switch to Gill here if they had any intention of playing Gill. But it's not too hard to understand how to do this from the Seth side. Lucia's approaches don't work, basically at all. The Seth player must choose the wrong V-skill for this to be a threat, because Seth's V-skill basically puts you in a stagger state immediately on contact. It does not generally matter what you were doing. Other characters, they have to worry at least about like Lucia going over something or her having the range to trade or something of that nature because they don't react fast enough. But Seth neither extends a hurt box nor is in any real danger. But I would still expect to switch to Gill regardless of all that. Here we are. Because Lucia can walk down Seth way easier. And being walked down by Lucia is not great. Because once she gets Seth to the corner, her own damage output, even though you wouldn't necessarily see it from our Lucia, her own damage output is pretty rough. Whereas this is a zoning match. You just understand how to zone, and with the correct use of Gill's parry, there's not really a lot you have to do. Lucia's attempts to approach Gill will generally lead to bad things for her, mainly due to that move. And Gill's backdash and timing for the backdash generally don't cause her to have any real advantage. It's one of those Illuminati problems. It's similarly difficult to play footsies against Gill as it is to do so against Colleen. And since Gill is so good at suppressing Lucia from having any meter in the long term, this matchup can end up being relatively difficult in a specific way if you don't know how best to approach it to begin with. That is the correct answer. The correct answer in this matchup is to just hit sweep. Why? You'd think that this would lead to you getting damaged a lot, but the thing that Gill has to use to punish the sweep is really relatively weak. And his own sweep isn't a thing he wants to use too much. So, for the most part, if you think you are playing footsies and bad things are going to happen, hitting sweep is generally among your better plans. Gill often, like Rillian, tends to push himself to positions where he can't get any good damage by doing anything else. And that is usually a good opening for you to hit the sweep because Gill puts himself at the negative position so that even if you hit it, he probably doesn't get much of a punish. He's not great at punishing long-range sweep in the first place. He has punishes, but they don't really hurt. And they often, in the mid-range, don't give him much advantage either. You're going to get much bigger payoffs from the times you land the sweep than Gill will ever get from the times he punishes them. And he can't switch to playing in a style that expects them either. Because to switch to expecting the sweep means that he will probably stop using almost all of his good options for the matchup. He also doesn't get that sort of thing either. The bigger question is what to do once you've hit him with sweep enough times, because it's not as if you're doing massive damage yourself. So if you're behind, for example here, you can't necessarily do anything with it. But it's more so to prevent you from getting overwhelmed. You can just use your fireball, particularly the straight up one, right then, because often, particularly if you landed the crush counter, you've got massive advantage then. See? Players are not generally thinking about this in that way, so you get a lot of mileage out of it. Fortunately for Gill, his parry is a parry that just hits lows. I don't think he has to parry low. If he does, this much harder, but I probably should have paid more attention to that. Unfortunately, Lucia does not actually have things like Wake Up Flame setups off sweep yet, so that would be the result you'd expect. If you don't have all your tools, you simply can't necessarily go full on, regardless of anything else.
It's go time.
Well, there's no real way to determine what they're likely to play this time. And technically, the best thing to do is for our Karin to switch to Cammy. If you were in a tournament, you'd want to just switch to Cammy, because Cammy is better at dealing with Gill and better at dealing with Seth. But that doesn't necessarily mean she's going to. It's just that if you were not practicing, if you were like, this is grand finals, I need to win this, you'd probably switch.
The time has arrived.
Particularly because while fighting Gill on Karin feels like it should be realistic and easy enough, it generally doesn't tend to be. Because Gill will, instead of letting you just Rasenha over fireballs, move to a position where Gill will attack, because he doesn't need to charge to do his tackles, and he has slightly stronger options in neutral. When they fail, he suffers for it, but they're slightly stronger. But Cammy has all of the same counters that Karin does for his options in neutral. And one more thing that most Gill will lose to: hooligan combination. In fact, specifically the throw version or low version of hooligan combination. You don't need to do the dive kick basically at all. That's the only time you actually do the dive kick part. Cammy similarly gets a lot out of just hitting sweep in this matchup. In fact, she's better at it than Lucia. In general, when Gill and characters like Gill are pressuring you in the corner, you can in fact hit sweep to get out of it as well, but Gill is slightly better at it than, say, a poison. The main thing that she needs here is to add in the last part. You must back heavy punch, back medium punch, sorry, the anti-air. Or Gill will do the sensible thing and start jumping at you. You're not going to manage the uppercut in time because he's not going to let you. There's too many other things he can do in neutral. And because she's low health and he does a ton of damage, you really gotta be ready for it. Like, every situation, you should be assuming back heavy punch is a thing that must happen now. That was good. Mostly from the perspective of, that wasn't really intended to hit. Readiness, but not readiness for the opponent's full movement. Still good though. As you can see, there's no zoning here. Gill immediately just moves to the next layer of this matchup. You can zone Cammy, but you're giving yourself extra work for no reason. She's squishy, and if you do win the bet in neutral, you will do half her health and damage. So just go for that. Also, she does get quite a bit out of her V skill, but not like a lot. So you don't necessarily have to care that much either. But because there's no zoning, Cammy doesn't have to necessarily fear backdashing. And since you have the backdash versus uppercut option set, there's really not a lot that you have to care about. There's the sweep. One of the few characters that can get away with doing that. Perfectly executed. I'm not sure whether or not that actually worked as the anti-air. He can force the trade, but it's still better to do it than not. One of the things you have to learn about Gill primarily is that he doesn't do a lot of damage until the situation is set up. So, getting hit by stuff in random neutral should never be your concern. Literally never. You're never trying to prevent it, you're never trying to avoid it. It'll cause you to lose footsies like that, for example. So don't think about it. Ooh, wasn't ready. But still. That was different. But I guess she's going to struggle with that one today. That's the sort of thing where the bots that we have available come in handy. Because it's easy enough to see, especially if I'm talking, that, oh, I have this giant hole in my defense because I don't do this thing. You could just train all week on that. Unfortunately, as you might expect, our group hasn't been able to get a lot of training in lately, so you're still going to see some shifts of those type. It is, of course, always useful to just know what to train on, though. And in the end, it's often not terribly useful for us to start winning against someone who has joined in, because once you beat them, they have to wait really long to get to play anymore. And given the high density of 2MK players in the lounge, it usually just goes straight back into us fighting each other. Alright, we now see moved on from the Seth matchup to the Gill matchup. This is much easier for Necalli except for one thing. So we're going to have to see whether or not the Gill player knows that one thing or not. Necalli isn't quite as good at doing the sweep thing as Cammy and Lucia, mainly because he actually gets punished for it. But he doesn't get punished that bad. But he faces the same problem in this matchup as in the Seth matchup. Has to be ready to air and not necessarily trained for it. The down forward heavy punch will also help here for the same similar reasons, to make sure you're not in that position for too long if you don't have to be. And that has similar uses. Generally you'll find that people who play two different characters that have the same output type, the same base strategy, are just using their experience from one to the other, and you can often expect them to play similarly. So while this isn't a matchup with Seth, it can still be fought as if it's Seth, because a lot of the things are going to be similar. The V skill is one of the better options here once Gill has slowed down. But that involves backdashing, and backdashing will eventually put you to the corner where Gill will just destroy you. So do be careful about that when you choose to do it. And there again you see what I mentioned before. Don't spend much time fearing the fact that you will take the mid damage in neutral. The fear of the getting hit in neutral against Gill is the thing that cripples a lot of players. If you're a footsie character who doesn't really have a lot of options, then maybe you have to fear. Chun-Li fears a bit, for example. Poison fears a bit, even though she's relatively zoning. But if your character is relatively powerful and explosive in any way, you shouldn't be fearing this aspect of it. Because you're not going to get slowly beaten to death and then still lose because your footsies weren't strong enough that you have the similar style of play, but Gill just has the explosive part. You should just assume, if we're in neutral, I don't really have to defend all that hard. If I get hit, it's probably not going to cripple me. You'll generally get killed for attacking and not doing the attack correctly. So getting stressed out about not being able to attack properly because of neutral is a bad plan. Just trust that you'll manage in neutral, or at least won't die, and plan your attack more calmly. Spending too much time on, oh, I need to take this chance because I won't get another, or defending for too long in the hopes that Gill will make a mistake, will work against players who don't play this character terribly often, but there are not a lot of Gill players that don't take Gill somewhat seriously. So, in general, you should just assume, oh, I'm going to have to do this way.
Round one.
The heavy kick would also help in this matchup, but again it would force Gill to jump, and Gill is a little harder to air than a lot of characters. I'd still suggest DWuulfe be ready for the heavy kick, more so than anything else. Because Gill doesn't punish it terribly well, so you don't really have to worry too much. Love that one, haven't seen it in a while. Gill is less likely to jump, that's the better explanation. If you hit Gill with the heavy kick, you've not really forced a scenario where it's like, okay, well now I'm in trouble or now I have to care. Gill will just wait there and ignore you mostly, because he does have options there that Seth doesn't have.
This ice shall be your doom. Round 2.
But it's still a good thing to use, primarily because it creates a scenario where Gill hasn't gotten anything he wants. And that's super important, because once Gill gets something he wants, you are really usually dead. Like this. He has a very boss character style. Once situation has become under his control, it's over already. Fortunately, this resets to neutral in the center, so it's not terrible. But even if one were to try to win from here, the methodology for it is so complicated that it's not really worth your effort. I wouldn't say drop it, but if you're already at last round, you should obviously do your best. But if you were not, the one thing I would suggest to someone is if you had another chance, just don't spend the meter. I have no idea which of the two I will get. Technically, both are difficult if I play Chun-Li, and therefore if I wanted my best chance of winning, the optimal scenario would be to play Bison. Even though I don't practice Bison, my chances are slightly better anyway, but I'm not going to do that because I'm not particularly interested in advancing forward anyway. And my last experience at a tournament was of this exact matchup. The player in question went on to win the tournament, so I obviously can't feel that terrible about it, but I still feel kind of bad because once they got started, I couldn't do much, but that's just Chun-Li as a general thing. But the thing I thought would stop them from getting started really didn't work at all, so I need a new strategy for this altogether. One of the easier things to do would be to switch to Hazanshu, and that would probably be just outright correct. But I don't think I need to do that as a whole. There's a specific spacing where Chun-Li has just enough control to not have to worry too much about Gill stuff. The problem is that I have to maintain that spacing for the entire match like this, or I won't ever get anywhere. And it's not terribly laggy, so that's good enough. What I expect you're about to see is either I'm going to counter a jump, or I'm going to get destroyed because of whatever happens first. You need a lot of that in this matchup. That was a big bet. But my opponent would have started a high energy chain that would probably have gotten them a victory anyway. I probably should have let them just so that I wouldn't have to think about it and they would have less meter. But Chun-Li takes very, very long and has a lot of stress getting out of Gill stuff like this. And of course your health disappears about this fast. So it's a very lopsided matchup based on which of the two characters has control of it for longer. And that is why it was technically a tactical error to not force my opponent to actually use all the meter to try to open me up. The problem, of course, is that a sufficiently skilled opponent will adapt around that, and that's what I was betting on. I was betting that the Gill player was going to just dash throw me, rather than using all of the meter to try to open me up.
Fight.
Ooh, did not expect that to hit me at all. I really should have... well, no, technically I did expect the jump. And didn't burst around it. Training to defend against this character is something you really should do. If you have Gill bot, the Gill bot is kind of hard to input, but you'd still get something out of it even if it wasn't great. Combo failed. But that's my largest problem here. The execution required for this matchup is beyond me usually. And every mistake is a good quarter of your health, because she stands or ends up too close when you make the mistakes. So, you are stuck in a relatively stressful situation of a character where you must do your risky, difficult execution to win and maintain control, but as soon as you lose it, you're just dead. Unfortunately, I don't get to see a lot of matches of this that don't go a specific other way. So, my refusal to change V skill and V trigger is probably holding me back in this matchup, as she has a lot more options for dealing with Gill's primary strategies once those are available, and she can keep him at bay for longer, but it does also prevent her from maintaining a specific type of control, and I feel like the combos aren't really easier. They're a little bit easier if you've practiced them long enough. The timing is easier, but if you like hit Gill in neutral randomly and losing a lot of your mobility without then getting punished for doing it, it's not necessarily a trade-off of, okay, well, this is great and you should obviously switch it. It's more so a problem of, if you want to switch and you're not good enough at the timing or the spacing for Hazanshu, you're not going to get anything out of it. So I would have to practice that for that matchup. If I were a pro player, I would definitely spend my time doing that. Because while I usually like to stick to exactly what my character does normally, it's not really great to spend my time on it when you just are giving up wins at high levels. Bison actually has a lot of similar situations, but one thing you can count on that makes this matchup relatively easy for Bison is that whenever Gill hits you, in nearly every situation that Gill hits you, other than that, Bison has advantage. Yes, Gill hits you, but as soon as you've been knocked down, Bison has advantage. Because Bison doesn't land in the same spot that most other characters do, because he doesn't get hit from the same spot that other characters do. So, generally, you should literally think of it as, aha, I have just taken damage. I am now on the ground. Situation optimal. I will attack. Because there's not a lot that Gill does well there, and if you're particularly good at defense, as JustVine is, you don't really care what he does.
It is time to proceed with round 2.
This also means that you don't really have to care so much about your specifics of your offense. You just use what you've got. In fact, most of the time, you're expecting that your opponent wants to throw you. Because if he doesn't throw you, he probably won't get anywhere. And he's not great on the wake-up stuff. He'll probably use super if he can, but if you've got enough advantage, it's probably better for Gill to just sit there and do nothing with meter. I don't think that dash block would normally have worked, but she still went for it. So now we see the correct outcome tactically. The meter has been held. The super is still an option on wake up. But the situation hasn't really changed. If Gill gets a knockdown, Bison doesn't care, because he wasn't standing in a place where that mattered, probably. And can afford to back roll out of pretty much everything. Technically, the correct thing to do in this matchup, I think, is to use use that more often. Because it lets you bypass specific parts of neutral in a way that pressures Bison anyway.
Time to return to harmony.
From the Bison side, I'm not really surprised at the V-Trigger 2 choice because the solution to being cornered by Gill is the same either way. But it still would probably be a little stronger against most Gill players to use V-Trigger 1 simply because the amount of benefit that Bison gets from dashing through Gill is very high. He doesn't have a multi-hit move, he doesn't have a double-sided hit move. He generally advances himself using a relatively slower move, and therefore can actually be punished even after you've dashed through him. And it prevents him from doing certain things to you in the corner once you've gotten your stuff going, as opposed to having to use your V-reversal to get out of it, and getting that happening. Okay, it's probably resolving itself now. Resolve. At this moment, it's a little bit hard sometimes to figure out what to do, but that's usually the correct thing, yes. If Bison has meter, there's no need to be particularly, worried at that range. You wouldn't necessarily want to go for the Inferno, because Gill actually can get through it with correct timing. And remembering to use the correct Inferno for the problem is kind of rough. Without meter, this is much harder, obviously. But JustVine has a lot of confidence in her defense under most scenarios, so I wouldn't be too worried about this.
It is time to proceed with the plan.
One of the main things you actually want to try to remember is that when Gill gets into that space where you've defended well for long enough, you can just use slide. Especially if he jumps at a spacing where he doesn't look like he's gonna make it. If he jumps too early, you might be able to slide, especially if you slide late. Or similarly, when you aren't really getting pushed to the corner that quickly, because he's not terribly good at it. And you back off a little bit, you realize, oh, I managed to make a couple steps back. Just slide, because most of the time, Gill's response to this is to jump, and he will go over you, and it won't actually cause anything to happen. See? He has combos from there, but only if he's very close. So you get to do it a lot. And since the opponent is then on guard for the slide, a lot of Bison's offense becomes more effective. The other reason this works is because it forces the opponent to enter their offensive mind state. which is generally a weaker mind state for most Gill players, and a weaker mind state for Gill as a character. Sure, you will take damage when that happens, but sometimes you have to risk it in order to get what you want. Once you have Gill cornered yourself, the corner guard isn't terribly difficult. You just have to learn when to be patient and when to do what you saw before. Basically just jump light kick, get the trade, keep control of the situation as best you can. Is this going to be enough? Leaves a little more meter. Got it. Even without that, having enough meter at that point was just enough to put Gill in a catch-22 situation. Can't necessarily do anything, can't jump out of the corner, and can't throw fireballs. It takes a little bit of effort from the Bison side to counter all of them correctly, but it's possible, and therefore the opponent has to care.
Round one.
I expected this to go on to be our last on-stream match of the night, and it seems like it is. The throw was probably the better choice. This is also exacerbated by the fact that JustVine is one of our better players at the whole I don't fear you in neutral situation. And being able to just fight Gill without even caring a little bit about damage that could be taken in neutral, especially on Bison, has a big payoff. So with all the parts in place, the best thing that Gill can usually do is go for his overhead more often. Not necessarily because he cares about landing the overhead, but simply because it forces Bison to play very slightly differently. Trying to catch Bison with your normal crouch medium punch, or setups based on that, is putting in a lot of effort and changing your mindset a little bit too much for benefits. You'll notice here that really it's not going to cause Bison to get opened up in nearly any situation. In fact, it's mostly just, once again, giving Bison an advantage by position without really paying off in any way for Gill. If you're autopiloting it, then so it goes. But it's also, unfortunately, a really easy button to dash through. So yeah, that doesn't help either. This will still do a lot of damage. And the slide. Without the slide, you will generally find that you don't manage to keep Gill under control for long enough to do anything. And again, if your opponent starts expecting the slide, it's on you to make the adaptation required to then go, okay, because you're now expecting the slide, I get my rest of my stuff. But that brings us to the end of our stream for tonight, and it seems that we have picked up some speed. Our Necalli for before is back, but we are off for the night. You can find our bots at 2-mk.org, Gill included. Good luck with that. And of course, whether or not we are streaming on any given day, you can find on our Twitter 2_mk_FGC. This has been Rillian 142MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.